The modern world is loud, crowded, and constantly connected. Yet something deeply human is quietly unraveling beneath the surface. We are told this is the most socially connected era in history, that everyone has a voice, a platform, and a community, yet loneliness is spreading faster than ever before. Tonight, we are going to talk about a subject many people sense, but few want to confront honestly, because once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it. Stay until the end, because what we are discussing is not just about dating or relationships, it is about the long term consequences of choices made over decades. And what happens when an entire society discovers that some doors do not reopen once they are slammed shut. Before we get into this, make sure you like the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell and select all so you get every single Angry Guy video the moment we release it. If you want to stay informed, grounded, and ahead of what is coming, that bell matters. Also, check out Angry's Crypto Academy, linked in the description below, where you can learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth by learning how to buy, sell, and trade crypto in a practical and realistic way. The Academy is built for people who understand that economic reality is changing and preparation is not optional. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to support the channel, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It helps keep the lights on and the content coming. Now, let us talk about what is actually happening, not the polished version presented on daytime panels or trending clips, but the reality unfolding in real time. We are witnessing a loneliness crisis among women that is being openly admitted on social media, in interviews, and in surveys, and yet the deeper reasons behind it are rarely examined honestly. Reports consistently show that a vast number of women now say they feel alone, disconnected, and lacking close personal bonds, even though they are more digitally connected than any generation before them. That contradiction alone should make people pause, because human connection was never meant to be replaced by screens, likes, or endless messaging. Social media creates the illusion of presence, but it does not replace trust, shared struggle, or the quiet stability that comes from real relationships built over time. For years, women were told that independence meant not needing men, that strength meant self sufficiency at all costs, and that traditional relationships were something to outgrow rather than something to value. Those messages were repeated so often that they became cultural assumptions. And once assumptions settle in, people stop questioning them until consequences appear. For decades, men were told explicitly and implicitly that they were the problem, that masculinity itself was dangerous, that traditional male roles were outdated, and that their presence in women's lives was optional at best and harmful at worst. Many men tried to adapt, tried to listen, tried to change, and were still told it was not enough. Over time, a large number of men simply stopped trying, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. When people are told repeatedly that they are unwanted, unnecessary, or inherently flawed, eventually they believe it, and belief shapes behavior. Men began to withdraw quietly, not in protest, not in rage, but in resignation. They focused on work, hobbies, health, finances, and personal peace. Dating slowed, marriage rates declined, and social interaction between men and women became more cautious, more transactional, and more tense. This was not a sudden event, but a gradual shift, like erosion, barely noticeable year to year, but unmistakable over time. At the same time, many women were encouraged to place faith in systems rather than relationships, to see the state, institutions, and ideology as more reliable than family, partnership, or community. The promise was simple and seductive. You do not need a man. You do not need a family structure. You do not need long term commitment, because independence and support will always be available through external systems. For a while, this seemed plausible, especially during times of economic growth and relative stability. But systems are not emotional beings, and they do not replace companionship, protection, or shared responsibility. As economic pressure increased, as inflation rose, and as housing and basic living costs became harder to manage alone, the limits of that promise began to show. Reality has a way of revealing flaws that ideology prefers to ignore. Now we see a growing number of women publicly expressing loneliness, confusion, and a sense of abandonment, often asking where the men went and why they are no longer showing up. The answer is uncomfortable but simple. Men did not disappear overnight. They responded to incentives and messaging over time. When participation in relationships came with increasing risk, decreasing appreciation, and constant suspicion, many men recalculated their involvement. They did not do this out of malice, but out of self preservation. Humans avoid environments where effort is punished and peace is unavailable. When men found that stepping back improved their mental health, financial stability, and sense of calm, many decided not to return. Walking away was not an act of revenge, it was an act of boundary setting. What makes this moment especially striking is that the same culture that dismissed men's concerns for years now expresses surprise at the outcome. When men said they felt unvalued, unheard, and replaceable, they were often told to adjust, to do better, or to stop complaining. Now that they have adjusted by removing themselves, the response is confusion and frustration. But social systems like economic systems respond to pressure, remove incentives and participation declines, add penalties and risk, and people minimize exposure. This is not ideology, it is human behavior. You cannot spend decades discouraging connection and then expect effortless reconnection when circumstances change. There is also a deeper biological and social reality that rarely gets discussed openly. Men and women evolved to operate in complementary roles, not identical ones. That does not mean rigid stereotypes, but it does mean interdependence. Family units, long term partnerships, and stable communities did not emerge by accident. They emerged because they worked. They distributed responsibility, created resilience, and allowed individuals to thrive within a supportive structure. When those structures weaken, individuals are forced to absorb pressures they were never meant to carry alone. Loneliness is not just an emotional state, it is a signal, like pain, indicating that something essential is missing. Ignoring that signal does not make it disappear, it only allows damage to accumulate. Many women today are discovering that independence without connection is not freedom, it is isolation. Autonomy without support becomes exhaustion. Choice without commitment becomes instability, and systems that once promised security are strained, slow, and impersonal. Meanwhile, the men who were once expected to provide stability have built quieter lives without constant conflict or expectation. They are not rushing back because there is nothing waiting for them that resembles balance or appreciation. This is the part that many people struggle to accept because it implies permanence. Some choices reshape landscapes so thoroughly that returning to the previous terrain is impossible. This is not about blame for its own sake, and it is not about celebrating anyone's hardship. It is about recognizing cause and effect. When you tell a group of people they are unnecessary long enough, eventually they believe you. When you dismantle social bridges piece by piece, eventually you find yourself standing alone on your side of the river. The tragedy is not that men walked away. The tragedy is that this outcome was predictable and preventable. But prevention requires humility, and humility has been in short supply for a very long time. We left off at the point where clarity becomes unavoidable because once consequences surface, explanations are no longer theoretical. What we are seeing now is not a temporary phase or a social media trend that will burn out and be replaced by the next viral talking point. This is the downstream result of decades of cultural conditioning, policy decisions, and personal choices interacting with basic human nature. Loneliness does not emerge in a vacuum. It grows when bonds are discouraged, when trust is undermined, and when cooperation is replaced by suspicion. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. For a long time, those warning signs were dismissed as exaggerations or resistance to progress. But reality does not negotiate with narratives, it simply arrives. One of the most uncomfortable truths in this entire discussion is that men did exactly what they were told to do. They stepped back, they disengaged, they stopped centering their lives around women who openly stated they did not want them in traditional roles. When men were told that their presence was optional and their contributions replaceable, many listened carefully. When they were told that pursuing relationships carried increasing personal and legal risk with diminishing emotional reward, they adjusted accordingly. This was framed by critics as immaturity or avoidance, but in every other context, risk management is considered rational behavior. No one calls a business reckless for exiting a bad deal. No one shames an investor for walking away from a market stacked against them. Yet when men did the same in their personal lives, it was labeled as a moral failing. What gets ignored is how quietly this happened. There were no marches, there were no demands, there was no coordinated movement at first. Men simply stopped showing up in the ways they used to. They stopped initiating, they stopped chasing, they stopped explaining themselves. They learned to live with less noise and fewer expectations. Many found that their stress levels dropped, their finances improved, their personal routines stabilized. Peace replaced constant tension. Once someone experiences that shift, convincing them to re enter chaos becomes extremely difficult. This is why calls for men to return to dating and marriage now often fall flat. They are being asked to give up peace in exchange for uncertainty, criticism, and conditional acceptance. Meanwhile, many women were assured that fulfillment would come through career achievement, personal freedom, and endless choice. None of those things are inherently bad, but they were presented as substitutes for long term companionship rather than complements to it. The result is that many women achieved independence without building interdependence. They learned to stand alone, but not how to build something shared. When economic conditions were favorable, that gap was less visible. But as inflation climbed, housing costs exploded, and everyday expenses became heavier, the practical benefits of partnership became obvious again. Shared responsibility is not outdated. It is efficient. It reduces pressure. It allows people to specialize and support each other. Removing it does not make life easier, it makes it heavier. Another layer to this crisis is the erosion of trust between men and women. Trust is not restored by slogans or campaigns. It is built slowly through consistent behavior over time. For years, men were told to be vulnerable, to open up, to express themselves honestly. Many who did found that vulnerability later used against them, whether socially, emotionally, or legally. Over time, men learn to guard themselves, not because they lack emotions, but because experience taught them that exposure carried consequences. You cannot demand openness while punishing it. You cannot encourage honesty while weaponizing it later. Trust dies when patterns repeat. Women, on the other hand, were often encouraged to view relationships through a lens of empowerment that framed compromise as loss and dependence as weakness. But all long term relationships involve compromise. All families involve mutual reliance. Independence sounds empowering until it becomes isolating. Strength sounds admirable until it requires carrying everything alone. When reality catches up, ideology offers little comfort. A slogan does not sit next to you at night. A system does not check on you when you are overwhelmed. A movement does not provide warmth, protection, or shared purpose. Those things come from people, not policies. What makes this moment particularly painful is that many women genuinely believed they were being guided toward a better future. They trusted voices that promised freedom without cost. Now, facing loneliness, many are confused rather than malicious. They are not asking for men back because they suddenly discovered tradition. They are asking because the alternative they were sold does not meet basic human needs. Unfortunately, by the time that realization sets in, many bridges have already burned. Men who spent years being dismissed, mocked, or treated as disposable are not eager to re enter a space where they expect the same dynamics to repeat. This is where the idea of irreversibility becomes important. Some social changes can be adjusted, others lock in outcomes for generations. Declining birth rates, delayed family formation, and the normalization of lifelong singleness are not easily reversed once they become standard. Cultural memory matters. Young men growing up today are watching what happened to previous generations. They are learning from observation, not instruction. When they see men punished for commitment and rewarded for withdrawal, they internalize that lesson early. By the time society attempts to course correct, the next generation has already adapted to the existing environment. There's also a biological clock that ideology cannot override. Time does not pause while culture debates. The window for forming families, building long term bonds, and raising children does not expand because people wish it would. When that window closes for large portions of a population, the consequences ripple outward. Fewer families mean fewer stable communities. Fewer children mean fewer future workers, caregivers, and taxpayers. Systems that promise to replace family structures rely on those very families to sustain them. When the base erodes, the entire structure weakens. Men walking away did not create this problem, but their absence exposes it. The silence left behind is louder than any argument. It forces society to confront questions it avoided for years. What actually holds people together? What motivates cooperation? What happens when mutual obligation is framed as oppression rather than partnership? These are not questions with easy answers, but ignoring them guarantees worse outcomes. You cannot build a stable society on permanent conflict between its members. And some will argue that this is just a transitional phase and that new models of relationships will emerge. That may be true to some extent. Humans adapt, but adaptation does not mean improvement. It often means survival under worse conditions. A generation raised without stable families adapts by lowering expectations, not by thriving. A culture built on distrust adapts by reducing vulnerability, not by deepening connection. Adaptation without wisdom produces colder, more fragmented societies, not stronger ones. What we are seeing now on social media, where women openly discuss loneliness and men openly discuss withdrawal, is not a debate. It is a report. It is a status update on a system that has already shifted. The arguments happening now are not shaping the outcome, they are reacting to it. That is why so many conversations feel circular and unproductive. People are arguing over moral framing while behavior has already changed. And behavior, not opinion, determines reality. Men who have walked away are not organizing to return under new terms. They are building lives that do not require permission or validation. They are opting out quietly and permanently. Many are not angry, they are simply done. That distinction matters because anger can be redirected, but indifference cannot. When someone no longer seeks approval or connection, leverage disappears. Appeals to guilt or nostalgia fall flat because there is no emotional investment left to activate. For women facing loneliness, this creates a painful paradox. The desire for connection remains, but the pool of willing participants has shrunk. And the men who remain are often those least interested in long term commitment, creating further dissatisfaction. This reinforces a cycle where expectations rise while availability drops, intensifying frustration on all sides. Without honest reflection on how things reach this point, that cycle continues. As we move forward, the question is not whether men will return to the roles they once filled. The evidence suggests they will not, at least not in significant numbers. The real question is whether society can acknowledge what was lost and why, without defaulting to blame or denial. Healing requires accountability, not scapegoats. It requires admitting that some narratives were incomplete and some promises were false. As the situation deepens, one of the most revealing developments is how institutions and media outlets have responded to the absence of men rather than addressing the causes that led to it. Instead of asking why participation declined, the focus often shifts to how to pressure or incentivize men to re engage without changing the underlying conditions that drove them away. Campaigns encourage men to date again, to open up again, to commit again, but they rarely acknowledge the accumulated experiences that taught men those actions came at a cost. This approach misunderstands human behavior at a fundamental level. People do not return to environments that harm them simply because they are told it is important for society. They return only when conditions genuinely change, and even then, trust must be rebuilt slowly. You cannot fast track reconciliation after decades of disregard. There is also a persistent attempt to frame male withdrawal as a social failure rather than a rational response. This framing is convenient because it avoids accountability. If men are the problem, then no introspection is required elsewhere. But this explanation collapses under scrutiny. Men did not lose the capacity for connection or commitment, they redirected it. They commit to work, to routines, to personal goals, to friendships with other men who understand their experiences. They still value loyalty and purpose, but they have learned to seek it in places where it is reciprocated. This is not dysfunction, it is adaptation. Pathologizing that adaptation does nothing to reverse it. At the same time, many women are being told that their loneliness is also a personal failing, that they simply need to adjust their expectations or work harder at self love. This message is equally hollow. Humans are not designed to self soothe indefinitely. Independence is not the absence of need, it is the ability to choose healthy interdependence. When society discourages the formation of stable bonds and then blames individuals for feeling isolated, it creates a double bind. People are punished for wanting what they were told to reject and shamed for feeling the consequences of rejection. The economic layer of this crisis deserves special attention because it strips away many comforting illusions. When costs were lower and incomes more forgiving, it was easier to pretend that partnership was optional. Today, the math no longer works for many people living alone. Housing costs consume disproportionate income. Healthcare expenses are unpredictable. Retirement planning is daunting without shared resources. These realities do not care about ideology, they force practical decisions. Historically, families and long term partnerships existed not just for emotional reasons, but because they were efficient units for survival and growth. Removing them without replacing their function leaves individuals exposed. Men recognized this exposure early. Many decided that if partnership no longer provided stability, then they would focus on self stabilization instead. They downsized expectations, simplified lives, and reduced liabilities. Some relocated, some opted out of consumer driven lifestyles. They learned to live within tighter, quieter frameworks. That adjustment made them less dependent on romantic relationships for meaning or security. Once that shift happens, persuasion loses its power. You cannot offer something as a solution when the problem has already been resolved in another way. Another overlooked factor is how dating itself has changed. The modern dating environment is often transactional, performance driven, and public. Private exploration has been replaced by constant comparison. Metrics replace intuition. Algorithms replace community. For many men, this environment feels hostile rather than inviting. Every interaction carries the potential for public judgment, misinterpretation, or reputational risk. In such a landscape, disengagement is not cowardice, it is caution. When risk outweighs reward, participation declines. This is true in every system humans interact with. Women navigating the same environment experience different pressures, but the outcome converges on the same emotional endpoint. Abundance of choice does not produce satisfaction when options lack depth or reliability. Constant evaluation erodes trust. When everyone is replaceable, no one feels secure. Loneliness thrives in environments where commitment is devalued and permanence is treated as suspicious. Technology accelerates this dynamic by offering endless novelty without accountability. The result is a population that is connected yet unsupported, visible yet unseen. The long term implications extend beyond individual dissatisfaction. Societies rely on stable pair bonds and families to transmit values, provide care, and maintain continuity. When those structures weaken, the burden shifts to institutions that are already strained. Social services cannot replace parents. Policies cannot replace presence. Communities cannot function when transient relationships replace enduring ones. The erosion of family units creates downstream effects that appear years later in mental health statistics, educational outcomes, and social cohesion metrics. These are not moral judgments, they are observable patterns. Men walking away accelerates this process, but it did not initiate it. It simply removed a stabilizing force that was taken for granted. For a long time, male participation in relationships and families was assumed, even when it was criticized. Men were expected to absorb blame and responsibility simultaneously. That contradiction was sustainable only as long as men accepted it. Once they stopped, the imbalance became visible. Expectations without participation collapse. Responsibility without authority breeds resentment. Eventually, the system breaks. There is also a generational component that cannot be ignored. Younger men are watching older men closely. They are seeing the outcomes of commitment under unfavorable conditions. They are observing divorce rates, custody disputes, financial losses, and social narratives that frame men as liabilities rather than partners. They are internalizing these observations long before they enter the dating market themselves. As a result, many young men approach relationships with skepticism or avoid them entirely. This is not indoctrination, it is pattern recognition. Women of the same generation are receiving conflicting messages. They are told they can have everything, but they are not shown how to integrate those ambitions into cooperative frameworks. They are encouraged to prioritize self fulfillment, but are rarely guided on how to build shared purpose. When disappointment arrives, they are told to double down on independence rather than reconsider assumptions. This delays course correction until options narrow and urgency increases. By then, resentment often replaces curiosity, making reconciliation harder. Attempts to engineer solutions through policy or cultural campaigns underestimate the organic nature of trust. You cannot mandate attraction. You cannot legislate desire. You cannot force people to invest emotionally where they do not feel safe or valued. Any effort to rebuild connection must start with honesty about past mistakes and a willingness to change behavior, not just language. Apologies without accountability feel hollow. Promises without evidence feel manipulative. People who have already exited do not respond to rhetoric. They respond only to sustained, observable change. What complicates this further is that many of the loudest voices calling for reconciliation are not offering reciprocity. They want men to return to previous roles without acknowledging how those roles were dismantled or disparaged. They want the benefits of partnership without the responsibilities of respect and cooperation. This imbalance is immediately recognizable to those who lived through it before. As a result, calls for unity ring false. Unity requires mutual obligation, not selective memory. If current trends continue, society will adapt in ways that are not necessarily healthier. Smaller households will become normal. Loneliness will be medicalized. Companionship will be commodified. Artificial substitutes will fill emotional gaps without addressing root causes. These adaptations may reduce immediate discomfort, but they do not replace the depth of human bonds built on shared sacrifice and trust. They treat symptoms while leaving the underlying condition intact. None of this means that reconciliation is impossible, but it does mean that it cannot be superficial. It would require a cultural reset that values cooperation over conflict and accountability over ideology. It would require acknowledging that men and women are not adversaries, but partners with different strengths and vulnerabilities. It would require dismantling narratives that frame dependence as weakness and compromise as defeat. These shifts take generations, not election cycles or media trends. For now, the reality remains stark. Many men have found peace outside the structures they were told to reject and then blamed for abandoning. Many women are confronting loneliness in a world that promised fulfillment without partnership. Both experiences are valid. Both are the result of the same broken assumptions. Healing will not come from doubling down on those assumptions. It will come, if at all, from the humility to admit that something essential was lost and cannot be replaced by substitutes. When discussions reach the stage, a common reaction is to search for someone to blame because blame feels like control. If a cause can be reduced to a villain, then reversing the outcome feels possible. But the truth is more uncomfortable. What happened was not the result of a single group acting in isolation. It was the accumulation of incentives, messaging, and lived experiences interacting over time. Systems shape behavior, and when systems reward withdrawal and punish participation, people withdraw. This is not ideological, it is behavioral gravity. Trying to shame men back into roles they exited willingly misunderstands that gravity entirely. Guilt based appeals fail because guilt requires emotional investment. Many men no longer feel emotionally tied to a system that dismissed them. You cannot guilt someone who has already accepted being disliked. That acceptance is liberating. Once someone stops seeking approval, moral pressure loses its force. This is why messaging that frames male disengagement as selfish or immature produces the opposite effect. It confirms the belief that participation will be met with contempt rather than respect. Every attempt to coerce reinforces the original decision to step away. There is also a misunderstanding about respect. Respect is not granted retroactively. It is not something that can be restored through declarations or campaigns. Respect emerges from consistent behavior over time. It grows when boundaries are honored, contributions are acknowledged, and differences are treated as complementary rather than threatening. When respect is withdrawn repeatedly, people adjust their expectations. They stop offering what is not valued. Asking for respect after dismissing it for decades sounds hollow to those who lived through that dismissal. Many women experiencing loneliness now are not malicious or manipulative. They are responding to a reality that no longer matches what they were promised. But intention does not erase impact. The cultural environment that discouraged reliance on men and minimized their role had predictable consequences. When that environment finally produces loneliness, Confusion follows. Unfortunately, confusion often turns into resentment, and resentment blocks reflection. Without reflection, the same patterns repeat under new labels. It is also important to understand that walking away does not mean bitterness. For many men, it means neutrality. They are not campaigning against relationships. They are not trying to convince others to follow them. They are simply choosing a life with fewer variables they cannot control. They invest where effort produces predictable results. They disengage where effort produces uncertainty and criticism. This mindset is rational, not reactive. It reflects a recalibration of priorities rather than an emotional wound. This neutrality is often misinterpreted as apathy or emotional deficiency. In reality, it is emotional conservation. Humans have limited emotional bandwidth. When too much of it is spent navigating conflict, misunderstanding, and accusation, something else gets sacrificed. Many men decided that sacrificing romantic involvement preserved mental health, focus, and autonomy. Once that trade off proves beneficial, reversing it requires overwhelming incentive. Nostalgia and moral appeals do not qualify. The conversation also tends to ignore the asymmetry of risk. Commitment carries different consequences depending on context. When legal, social, and financial risks disproportionately affect one side, participation declines on that side. This is not a moral statement, it is a risk assessment. Men learned that the cost of a failed relationship could extend far beyond emotional disappointment. They adapted accordingly. Ignoring this asymmetry while demanding engagement is like ignoring weather conditions while blaming people for staying indoors. At the individual level, this creates a quiet tragedy. Many people on both sides genuinely want connection, but the conditions required for trust no longer exist at scale. When trust erodes, people default to self protection. Self protection looks like independence, it looks like detachment, it looks like lowered expectations. Over time, these coping strategies become lifestyles. Lifestyles solidify into norms. Norms shape future behavior. This is how temporary adaptations become permanent social features. Younger generations are growing up inside this new normal. They do not remember a time when long term commitment was assumed or celebrated universally. They see relationships as optional, fragile, and risky. They internalize caution early. For them, walking away is not a protest, it is baseline behavior. When baseline behavior shifts, recovery becomes exponentially harder. You cannot appeal to lost values that were never experienced. There is also a misconception that men are simply waiting for better offers. In reality, many are not waiting at all. They have structured lives that do not leave space for romantic negotiation. They have optimized routines around solitude, friendships, and personal goals. Reintroducing another person would require reconfiguring systems that already work. That is a high bar. Without compelling evidence that the new arrangement will be stable and respectful, the cost outweighs the benefit. On the other side, many women are discovering that self sufficiency does not insulate against emotional need. The narrative that emotional fulfillment can be indefinitely postponed or outsourced collapses under lived experience. Humans are relational by nature. Independence addresses survival. Connection addresses meaning. When meaning erodes, productivity and pleasure follow. This is why loneliness feels heavier than exhaustion. It signals a deeper absence. The danger now is in reactive solutions. When societies panic, they reach for shortcuts. They medicalize loneliness. They commercialize companionship. They offer substitutes rather than repair. These measures may ease symptoms temporarily, but they do not restore trust or cooperation. They create parallel systems that normalize fragmentation. Over time, fragmentation becomes identity. People begin to see isolation as natural rather than imposed. Repair, if it is possible at all, would require abandoning zero sum narratives. It would require acknowledging that cooperation benefits both sides. It would require redefining strength not as independence at all costs, but as the ability to build something resilient with another person. That shift cannot be mandated. It must be modeled. It must be rewarded socially, legally, and culturally. Without aligned incentives, messaging remains noise. The hardest part of this entire situation is accepting that some damage cannot be undone quickly. Social trust is slow to build and fast to break. Once broken at scale, it takes generations to rebuild, if it happens at all. Many people alive today will not see a return to the relational norms they grew up expecting. That does not make them failures. It makes them participants in a historical transition. For individuals navigating this landscape, clarity becomes more valuable than hope. Hope without realism leads to repeated disappointment. Clarity allows for informed choices. Some will continue seeking partnership with adjusted expectations. Others will invest in alternative forms of meaning. Neither path is inherently wrong. What is destructive is pretending that old assumptions still apply. They do not. At the end of the day, societies are built on cooperation, not slogans. When cooperation collapses, no amount of rhetoric can substitute for it. Men walking away did not create loneliness, they revealed it. Women experiencing loneliness did not fail. They encountered reality after ideology fell short. The only question that remains is whether honesty will follow or whether comfort will continue to be chosen over truth. And that question matters because the future does not wait for consensus. It is shaped by behavior, not arguments. Every choice made now echoes forward. Every adaptation teaches the next generation what to expect. Whether those expectations lead to stability or fragmentation depends on whether people are willing to confront uncomfortable truths rather than defend comforting myths. At this stage of the conversation, something important becomes clear that many people resist acknowledging, and that is the difference between wanting an outcome and being willing to create the conditions for it. Wanting connection is not the same as fostering trust. Wanting companionship is not the same as being cooperative. Wanting stability is not the same as supporting structures that produce it. For years, society focused heavily on outcomes while dismantling the processes that made those outcomes possible. When the results failed to appear, confusion replaced accountability. This pattern repeats across many domains, but nowhere is it more visible than in relationships between men and women. One of the most persistent myths is that men can simply be encouraged back into participation through reassurance alone. This misunderstands how deeply behavioral learning runs. People learn far more from consequences than from messaging. If someone repeatedly experiences negative outcomes after certain actions, no amount of verbal encouragement will override that conditioning. Men who experience dismissal, suspicion, or disproportionate consequences learn to associate intimacy with instability. That association does not disappear because circumstances shift later. It requires consistent counter evidence over time, not promises. There is also a tendency to treat male withdrawal as a temporary emotional reaction rather than a structural adaptation. But for many men, walking away was not an emotional collapse, it was a strategic decision. They evaluated their environment and adjusted behavior to reduce risk and maximize peace. Strategic decisions do not reverse easily, especially when they produce measurable improvements in quality of life. Asking someone to abandon a strategy that works requires offering a superior alternative, not an appeal to duty. Meanwhile, many women are being encouraged to interpret male absence as abandonment rather than response. That framing feels validating in the short term, but prevents understanding in the long term. If men left because they were never valued, the solution would involve restoring value. If men left because they feared harm, the solution would involve reducing risk. If men left because they found peace elsewhere, The solution would involve offering peace, not pressure. But pressure is often easier than change, so it becomes the default response. The deeper issue here is that modern culture often confuses equality with sameness. Men and women are equal in worth, but they are not interchangeable in function or experience. Expecting identical responses to identical conditions ignores differences in risk exposure, incentives, and social expectations. When policies and narratives flatten these differences, they create uneven outcomes. Those outcomes then get misinterpreted as moral failings rather than design flaws. Another rarely discussed factor is fatigue. Social fatigue accumulates quietly. Years of conflict framing, constant negotiation, and public scrutiny wear people down. Many men reached a point where they no longer had the energy to explain themselves, defend their intentions, or justify their presence. Silence became easier than dialogue. Withdrawal became easier than participation. Once fatigue sets in at that level, recovery is slow and uncertain. Women are experiencing a different form of fatigue. They are exhausted from being told they must be everything at once: independent, successful, fulfilled, socially connected, emotionally satisfied, and resilient at all times. This expectation leaves little room for vulnerability or dependence without shame. When loneliness appears, it feels like personal failure rather than systemic imbalance. That internalization makes honest conversation harder because admitting need feels like defeat rather than honesty. The tragedy is that both sides are responding to pressure in predictable human ways. Men reduce exposure to harm. Women attempt to carry increasing burdens alone. Neither approach produces long term well being. Both are survival strategies in an environment that discourages cooperation. Survival strategies can keep people functioning, but they rarely allow people to flourish. What complicates any attempt at resolution is that public discourse rewards outrage and simplification. Nuance does not trend. Accountability does not go viral. As a result, conversations about this topic are often dominated by extremes that do not represent most people. The quiet majority, those who feel disoriented and uncertain rather than hostile, are rarely heard. Their silence creates the illusion of polarization, even when many share similar frustrations and unmet needs. There is also an element of time compression caused by technology. Social changes that once unfolded over generations now occur within decades. This acceleration reduces the window for reflection and adjustment. Mistakes compound faster than corrections can be implemented. By the time consequences become obvious, the structures that produce them are already normalized. This makes reversal exponentially harder. Some argue that future generations will invent entirely new relationship models that bypass these issues. That optimism underestimates the constraints of human psychology. People still seek trust, reliability, and shared meaning. Technology can change how people meet, but it cannot change what sustains them. Any model that ignores these fundamentals will produce the same dissatisfaction under a different label. Men who have stepped away often articulate a sense of clarity rather than loss. They understand what they gave up, but they also understand what they gained. They gained predictability, they gained autonomy, they gained emotional quiet. Those gains are tangible. Asking them to surrender those gains requires demonstrating that partnership can enhance rather than threaten them. That demonstration has not yet occurred at scale. Women confronting loneliness often articulate a sense of betrayal rather than reflection. They feel the world did not deliver what was promised. In many cases, that feeling is justified. Promises were made without sufficient evidence. But betrayal without examination leads to resentment, and resentment blocks learning. Without learning, the same expectations persist even as reality contradicts them. This dynamic creates a stalemate. Men are not returning because conditions have not changed. Women are not adjusting expectations because they were assured those expectations were valid. Institutions respond by offering superficial fixes that address optics rather than structure. The result is prolonged dissatisfaction rather than resolution. The uncomfortable truth is that rebuilding trust would require a cultural humility that is currently absent. It would require admitting that some narratives caused harm. It would require revaluing cooperation without framing it as regression. It would require acknowledging that stability is not oppression and dependence is not weakness when it is mutual. These admissions threaten deeply held identities, which is why they are resisted. For individuals, this means navigating a landscape where collective solutions are unlikely in the short term. Personal clarity becomes essential. Understanding incentives, recognizing patterns, and making decisions based on reality rather than expectation becomes a form of self protection. This applies to men and women alike. Waiting for society to resolve these tensions is a recipe for prolonged frustration. Some will accuse this perspective of pessimism. It is not pessimism, it is realism. Pessimism says nothing can improve. Realism says improvement requires acknowledging constraints. Optimism without realism is fantasy. Realism without despair allows for adaptation. Because the greatest harm comes not from difficulty itself, but from surprise. When people are unprepared for reality, they experience it as trauma rather than challenge. Preparation changes everything. Understanding changes everything. And clarity, even when it is uncomfortable, is the most compassionate thing that can be offered in a time of confusion. This conversation is not meant to inflame, it is meant to illuminate. If people are willing to look honestly at what unfolded and why, there is at least the possibility of wiser choices going forward. If not, the patterns we see now will simply harden into norms, and future generations will inherit a world where isolation is expected and connection is rare. That future is not inevitable, but avoiding it requires more than good intentions. It requires courage to question comforting stories, discipline to change behavior, and patience to rebuild what was broken slowly rather than demand instant results. Whether society is capable of that remains an open question. But pretending the question does not exist ensures the answer will not change. And that brings us to the core of the issue. This is not about men versus women. It is about whether cooperation can survive in a culture that has spent decades treating it as optional. The answer will shape not just relationships, but communities, economies, and the emotional landscape of the generations that follow. As this reality continues to unfold, another pattern becomes impossible to ignore. And that is how quickly discomfort turns into denial when accountability feels threatening. Many people sense that something fundamental has gone wrong, yet resist naming it because naming it would require reassessing beliefs they built their identity around. When identity and ideology merge, correction feels like erasure. This is why conversations stall. It is easier to argue than to reflect. It is easier to label than to listen. And it is far easier to demand change from others than to accept that change may be required internally. One of the most damaging habits that developed over the years is the framing of relationships as negotiations of power rather than collaborations of trust. When every interaction is filtered through who gains more and who gives up more, cooperation erodes. Trust cannot survive in an environment where motives are always questioned and generosity is treated as weakness. Many men recognized early that the emotional cost of constant negotiation was higher than the benefit of companionship under those terms. Walking away simplified life because it removed a battlefield that never seemed to close. Women, meanwhile, were often encouraged to see self reliance as a shield against disappointment rather than as one component of a balanced life. Over time, this framing created a pressure to suppress vulnerability even when vulnerability was appropriate. When loneliness surfaced, it felt like a personal failure rather than a signal that something essential was missing. That internal conflict intensified isolation. People surrounded by others can still feel profoundly alone when they believe their needs are illegitimate. Another uncomfortable truth is that many of the voices that shaped this cultural shift will never acknowledge their role in its outcome. They have already moved on to new narratives, leaving others to deal with the consequences. This creates a sense of abandonment that compounds loneliness. When people realize that the architects of an idea are not present to help repair the damage, trust in guidance itself erodes. People become skeptical, not just of relationships, but of advice, movements, and institutions. Men who stepped away often describe a period of adjustment followed by relief. The adjustment phase was difficult. It involved redefining purpose, restructuring routines, and letting go of expectations ingrained since youth. But once that phase passed, relief followed. Life became quieter. Decisions became simpler. Emotional energy could be directed inward rather than outward. That relief is rarely discussed publicly because it contradicts narratives that frame male disengagement as loss alone. For many, it was a trade off that favored stability over uncertainty. Women experiencing loneliness often describe a different trajectory. The early years of independence felt empowering, choice felt abundant, validation felt accessible. Over time, however, abundance became noise, validation lost meaning, choice became overwhelming rather than liberating. When depth was needed, it was difficult to find. The shift from empowerment to emptiness was gradual, making it harder to identify until it was fully present. This mismatch in timelines fuels misunderstanding. Men often processed disillusionment earlier and adapted sooner. Women often encountered disillusionment later when adaptation options were narrower. This temporal gap creates frustration on both sides. Men feel misunderstood when asked to return to a system they already exited. Women feel abandoned when they realize the system they trusted is no longer functioning. Both experiences are real, yet they rarely meet in conversation. Public dialogue tends to collapse these experiences into moral judgments, which prevents resolution. When pain is moralized, people defend rather than explore. When defense becomes the goal, learning stops. This is why so many discussions go in circles. Everyone is speaking, but no one is listening with the intent to understand rather than respond. Another layer often ignored is how peace changes priorities. Men who found peace outside traditional relationships often redefined success. Success became freedom from constant tension. It became control over time. It became predictability. These values do not disappear when circumstances shift. They become filters through which new opportunities are evaluated. If a relationship threatens those values, it is rejected, regardless of external pressure. Women facing loneliness often attempt to reconcile new needs with old narratives. This creates internal conflict. Wanting companionship feels like betrayal of past beliefs. Admitting that independence alone is insufficient feels like admitting error. Many resolve this conflict by blaming external forces rather than reevaluating assumptions. That resolution protects identity but delays growth. The result is a social environment where many people feel stuck. Men feel settled but disconnected from broader society. Women feel connected but unsettled internally. Institutions attempt to bridge this gap with language that sounds hopeful but lacks substance. Without structural change, language becomes noise. Structural change would require addressing incentives honestly. It would require aligning emotional, social, and economic rewards with cooperative behavior rather than conflict. It would require reducing unnecessary risk and restoring trust through consistent action rather than symbolic gestures. These changes are difficult because they challenge entrenched systems and narratives. Difficulty, however, does not make them optional. One reason progress feels stalled is that responsibility is diffuse. Everyone contributed a little, which makes ownership uncomfortable. When everyone is partially responsible, no one feels obligated to lead repair. This paralysis benefits those who prefer the status quo, even when the status quo produces dissatisfaction. For individuals, the path forward often involves disengaging from collective narratives and focusing on personal alignment. This does not mean isolation from others, but isolation from unrealistic expectations. It means building life structures that reflect reality rather than aspiration alone. It means choosing peace deliberately rather than chasing validation. Men who have done this often report increased resilience. They are less reactive to cultural swings. They are less dependent on external approval. They are more grounded in routines that sustain them regardless of social trends. This grounding makes them appear distant or indifferent, but it is often simply stability. Women navigating loneliness face a harder recalibration because the culture encouraged external orientation for so long. Reorienting inward while still seeking connection requires nuance. It requires rejecting extremes without rejecting need. That balance is difficult in a discourse dominated by absolutes. The danger now is that without honest recalibration, loneliness will continue to be treated as a mystery rather than a message. Messages ignored repeat louder. When loneliness becomes normalized, it reshapes expectations. People stop seeking depth because they no longer believe that it is attainable. That resignation is more damaging than loneliness itself because it extinguishes hope rooted in reality. Hope grounded in reality acknowledges constraints and works within them. It does not promise effortless fulfillment. It does not deny trade offs. It respects human limits. Such hope is quieter than slogans, but far more durable. As this discussion continues, it becomes clear that resolution, if it comes at all, will not come from winning arguments. It will come from changing behavior, from rewarding cooperation, from rebuilding trust slowly, from accepting that some doors close and others must be built anew. This is not a call to return to the past. The past cannot be recreated. It is a call to stop pretending that removing foundational structures has no custodians. Every system rests on something. When that something erodes, instability follows. Understanding this does not guarantee a better future, but misunderstanding it guarantees a worse one. The choice facing society is not between tradition and progress, it is between honesty and denial, between adaptation with wisdom and adaptation by accident. The men who walked away adapted deliberately. The women now confronting loneliness are being forced to adapt under pressure. Whether those adaptations converge or diverge further will depend on whether truth is allowed to surface without punishment. Because the greatest obstacle to repair is not disagreement, it is the refusal to acknowledge cause and effect. And until that acknowledgement happens, the silence left by those who walked away will continue to speak louder than any argument. As we move deeper into this discussion, another reality comes into focus that many people sense intuitively but struggle to articulate clearly. And that is the difference between loneliness caused by circumstance and loneliness caused by structure. Circumstantial loneliness comes and goes. It happens after a breakup, a relocation, a life transition. Structural loneliness is different. It is baked into the environment. It persists even when people try to connect. It shows up not because effort is absent, but because the systems that once facilitated connection have been weakened or removed. What we are witnessing now is not a wave of people failing to try. It is a society that quietly dismantled the conditions that allowed connection to thrive and is now surprised by the result. For years, connection was treated as something that should happen naturally without support, investment, or protection. The idea that relationships require cultivation, patience, and shared responsibility was reframed as outdated or restrictive. In its place came the belief that connection should be effortless, constantly fulfilling, and individually optimized. When that expectation met reality, disappointment followed. Real relationships are not optimized experiences, they are negotiated realities. They involve friction, sacrifice, and growth over time. Removing tolerance for friction removes the possibility of depth. Men, observing the shift, learned that tolerance for friction was no longer reciprocated. Effort was scrutinized rather than appreciated. Intent was questioned rather than assumed. Over time, this taught men that investing emotionally carried asymmetric risk. When risk becomes asymmetric, participation declines. This is not cynicism, it is pattern recognition. And once a pattern is recognized consistently, behavior adjusts accordingly. Women, on the other hand, were often encouraged to believe that emotional fulfillment would emerge automatically once external barriers were removed. Remove dependence, remove tradition, remove obligation, and fulfillment would appear. But fulfillment does not emerge from absence, it emerges from presence, from shared effort, from mutual investment. When absence was mistaken for freedom, the space left behind was not filled with meaning. It was filled with noise, distraction, and eventually silence. This silence is what many women are now confronting. Not the silence of being unseen, but the silence of having no one to turn toward when the noise fades. That silence is unsettling because it forces questions that were postponed. Questions about long term companionship, about shared purpose, about whether independence was meant to be a destination or a foundation. These questions do not have easy answers, and they are uncomfortable precisely because they challenge narratives that were once celebrated. At the same time, men living quieter lives are not immune to questions either. Peace does not eliminate reflection, it simply removes urgency. Many men reflect on what was lost, but they do so without panic. They accepted trade offs early, they structured their lives accordingly. That acceptance creates emotional stability, even when it includes solitude. Stability is often mistaken for happiness, but it is something equally valuable. It allows people to function without constant turbulence. This difference in emotional timelines continues to drive misunderstanding. When one group has already processed loss and moved on, and another is only beginning to feel it, conversation becomes difficult. One side speaks from resolution, the other speaks from urgency. Urgency often demands immediate change. Resolution resists disruption. Neither side is wrong, but they are out of sync. Public discourse rarely accounts for this timing mismatch. Instead, it compresses experiences into simplified narratives that inflame rather than inform. Men are portrayed as abandoning responsibility. Women are portrayed as demanding rescue. These portrayals are incomplete and misleading. Most people are simply responding to incentives and conditions as they exist. They are not villains. They are adaptive organisms navigating a changing environment. Another aspect that deserves attention is how emotional labor has been framed. For years, emotional labor was discussed as something men failed to provide and women carried disproportionately. What went largely unexamined was how emotional labor was also expected of men in increasingly complex and contradictory ways. Men were expected to be emotionally open, but emotionally stable, vulnerable, but resilient, expressive, but controlled. These expectations are not impossible, but they require trust. Without trust, they become traps. Many men learned that emotional openness could be reinterpreted negatively, leading them to withdraw not from emotion itself, but from contexts where emotion felt unsafe. Women, conversely, were often encouraged to express emotion freely, but discouraged from acknowledging dependence. This created a paradox where emotional expression was validated, but emotional reliance was stigmatized. Over time, this produced emotional abundance without emotional anchoring. Expression without grounding eventually leads to exhaustion rather than relief. These dynamics intersect with broader economic and social pressures. As life becomes more demanding, people need reliable support systems more, not less. Removing informal support while formal system strain creates vulnerability. Loneliness intensifies under pressure because there is no buffer. Historically, families and partnerships provided that buffer. Without them, individuals absorb shocks alone. Some respond by becoming hyper independent, others respond by seeking constant stimulation. Neither approach replaces genuine support. Hyper independence hardens people, constant stimulation numbs them. Both are defenses against vulnerability in an environment perceived as unsafe. What makes the current moment particularly significant is that these patterns are no longer hidden. They are visible in data, conversations, and lived experience. The question is no longer whether something is wrong, but whether society is willing to interpret the signal accurately. Signals misread become warnings ignored. There is a temptation to believe that time alone will fix this, that generational turnover will naturally correct imbalances. But time only fixes problems when incentives change. Without incentive alignment, time entrenches patterns. Children raised observing withdrawal and loneliness internalize those behaviors as normal. They adapt early. Early adaptation hardens into identity. Identity resists change. This is why calls for quick fixes feel hollow. Trust does not rebuild on schedules. Cooperation does not return because it is requested. It returns when people feel safe enough to risk again. Safety is not declared, it is demonstrated consistently. For individuals listening to this, the most important takeaway is not despair, but discernment. Understanding the environment allows for better personal decisions. It allows people to set realistic expectations, choose relationships carefully, and avoid internalizing systemic outcomes as personal failure. Clarity protects mental health. Confusion erodes it. Men who have chosen distance are not obligated to return. Women who feel lonely are not weak. Both are responding to conditions that did not arise overnight. Compassion begins with understanding, not accusation. Understanding does not require agreement, it requires honesty. Because the most damaging outcome is not loneliness itself, it is the normalization of loneliness as inevitable. When people accept isolation as the cost of modern life, they stop questioning systems that produce it. They stop seeking better arrangements. They lower expectations to survive rather than raising standards to thrive. The silence left by men walking away and the loneliness voiced by women now form a single message, not opposing ones. That message says something essential was disrupted. Ignoring that message will not make it disappear. Interpreting it honestly is the only chance to learn from it. And learning, even late, is still better than denial. As we reach the final stretch of this conversation, it becomes necessary to pull everything together without softening the reality or inflating it into spectacle. What we are witnessing is not a momentary crisis that will resolve itself through optimism or messaging. It is a structural consequence of long term decisions interacting with human nature. When structures change, behavior follows. When behavior changes at scale, culture follows. And once culture shifts, reversal is slow, uncertain, and often incomplete. And the most important realization is that no group holds a monopoly on pain in this situation. Men who walked away did so after years of accumulated experience that taught them withdrawal was safer than engagement. Women who now experience loneliness are confronting a gap between what they were promised and what actually sustains human well being. Both realities exist simultaneously. Pretending otherwise only deepens division. What makes honest dialogue so difficult is that it requires people to accept that good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes. Many ideas that were promoted as liberating carried hidden costs that were not acknowledged at the time. Admitting this feels like betrayal to those who built identity around those ideas. But refusing to admit it transfers the cost to individuals who must live with the consequences. Societies that prioritize ideological consistency over lived reality eventually fracture under the weight of that refusal. Another truth that must be stated plainly is that reconciliation cannot occur on demand. You cannot summon trust after it has been eroded. You cannot restore cooperation without restoring incentives. You cannot ask people to risk what they have learned to protect without offering something demonstrably better. Appeals to nostalgia or duty do not substitute for safety and respect. For men who have stepped away, life has become smaller in some ways and larger in others. Smaller in emotional exposure, larger in autonomy and control. They have learned to define fulfillment internally rather than relationally. This does not make them cold or broken. It makes them adapted to the environment they experienced. Expecting them to reverse that adaptation without evidence of change misunderstands adaptation itself. For women experiencing loneliness, the adjustment is more turbulent because it collides with identity. Many were encouraged to believe that need itself was weakness. Rediscovering need later in life feels like regression rather than growth. But need is not weakness, it is information. It signals where cooperation once existed and where it may be needed again. Ignoring that signal prolongs suffering. What often goes unspoken is that neither side can solve this alone. Men cannot restore partnership unilaterally. Women cannot rebuild trust unilaterally. Institutions cannot manufacture intimacy. Culture cannot be repaired through slogans. Repair, if it happens, must emerge from changed behavior, reinforced consistently over time. That is slow work. It is unglamorous. It does not trend. This is why many people will not experience resolution within their own lifetimes. That is not a condemnation. It is a recognition of how deep these shifts run. Some generations absorb the cost of transition so that future generations may inherit better conditions. That has happened repeatedly throughout history. The mistake would be pretending that this transition has no cost or that it can be skipped. For individuals listening to this, the most productive response is not rage or despair. It is discernment. Discernment means understanding incentives. It means recognizing patterns without demonizing people. It means choosing relationships carefully rather than compulsively. It means valuing peace without confusing it for isolation. It means allowing connection where trust is earned rather than assumed. Men who choose to remain solitary are not obligated to justify that choice. Women who seek connection are not obligated to apologize for wanting it. Both deserve honesty about what the current environment supports and what it does not. False hope is more damaging than hard truth. Hard truth allows for preparation. Preparation restores agency. As society continues to adjust, there will be attempts to reframe loneliness as a personal flaw rather than a systemic outcome. Resist that framing. Loneliness on this scale is not an individual failure. It is a signal that something foundational has shifted. Signals deserve interpretation, not dismissal. There will also be attempts to rush reconciliation by redefining terms without changing substance. That will fail. People sense incongruence instinctively. Words without aligned action deepen distrust. Trust returns only when behavior changes first and language follows. The future likely holds a mix of outcomes. Some will build smaller, quieter partnerships grounded in realism rather than idealism. Some will remain alone and find meaning through purpose, contribution, or creation. Some will oscillate between hope and withdrawal. None of these paths are inherently shameful. What matters is whether people are choosing consciously rather than being carried by narratives that no longer match reality. At the societal level, the choice is between continuing to deny cause and effect or facing it with humility. Denial feels easier in the short term. Humility feels threatening. But humility is the only posture that allows learning. Without learning, patterns repeat. Repeated patterns harden. Hardened patterns become destiny. The silence left by men walking away is not empty. It communicates boundaries, lessons, and consequences. The loneliness voiced by women is not weakness, it communicates unmet needs and broken promises. Together, these signals form a single message. Something essential was disrupted. Ignoring that message guarantees more of the same. Whether society listens is an open question, but individuals can listen now. Individuals can adjust now. Individuals can choose clarity over comfort and preparation over denial. That choice does not solve everything, but it prevents further harm. Before we wrap this up, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed here today? Do you agree with the analysis or see it differently? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts because this conversation matters and honest discussion is the only way forward. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.